way you turn these on, hold down the mute button, like this. This same way. And both batteries on these are full.
Okay. Can I bring them in the back of them so I don't have to walk to the front? Okay. They won't.
If you get too close to the lavaliers or to the Bohan mic, they might, otherwise you should be fine. We're having an issue with the power. That's the only thing. So I can't guarantee it. Something just popped in. Okay. That's something I can't fix, that's. What I'll do is if I know it's a guy, I'll come. Let me know, what I'll do is. Black shirt.
months ago. But they won't do that in New York.
Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you, Tim. I'm Jim Goldgeier, Dean of the School of International Service, and it's a great pleasure to have you here for our first Dean's discussion of the academic year, and just delighted that my colleague Vali Nasr, Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, is here with us today. We had scheduled a Dean's discussion with Vali back in, I think, February, and got snowed out. And a lot has happened in the region we're going to discuss since then. Right. So it's probably not so terrible that we had to be patient and wait, but thank you for your patience. And really wonderful to have Vali here. He's just done a remarkable job in the last couple of years at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and prior to that he was a special advisor to the special representative on Afghanistan and Pakistan, Richard Holbrooke, the late Richard Holbrooke, who he really writes about quite beautifully in this book. And before that was a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Previous books include The Shia Revival and Forces of Fortune, and this book, The Dispensable Nation, America, Foreign Policy and Retreat, really covers a wide range of issues, not just Afghanistan and Pakistan, but Iraq and other important issues that remain with us. And for those of you who are new to the Dean's discussion, I actually just do the first part of the discussion and get things started, and then we'll turn it over to you to ask questions that you have. But welcome.
Thank you.
So I thought it'd actually be useful before we get into some of the specific issues that we're dealing with today, for those students who may not be aware of Richard Holbrooke and the kind of impact that he had in this country as a diplomat. I mean, a man who was such an incredible presence in the American diplomatic community and served so ably across a number of administrations, as well as when he wasn't in government in the private sector, and also a terrific author as well, and just a real force of nature. If you just say a few words about Ambassador Holbrooke.
So first of all, let me thank you, Jim, for inviting me here, and I'm so glad that despite the snow, we could reschedule and to be here. It's truly a pleasure, and I very much welcome the opportunity to interact with the student and faculty here, especially as events have become even more timely than when we first scheduled this conversation. I actually met Richard Holbrooke fairly later in my career. I was already a professor when I met him, and then he invited me to work with him first on Hillary Clinton's campaign, and then when he went to the State Department on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I often wondered, what would have been the impact if I had met him when I was much younger or was your age. So in many ways, his career began, like many of you, after he finished his undergraduate work. I think he studied history. He joined the Foreign Service, worked in Vietnam, and he was a very stellar, hard worker. And he often used to say that, that first job you get and what you make of it, and is very important, and what's the importance of finding a good mentor that actually teaches you, hones your skills, gives you advice, is extremely important. So he was discovered by the ambassador then, I think it was Maxwell Taylor, a very famous American diplomat who was ambassador to Vietnam, on a tour he was making on Mekong Delta. He sort of thought he was an intelligent young staffer, brought him with him to Saigon, groomed him, so he served as a staffer to 2 ambassadors, and that was the beginning of his career. And then he became the youngest Assistant Secretary of State in State Department's history, and from that purview, he found a way to manage the Balkan crisis, and I think probably one of the high points of modern American diplomatic history is the Dayton Accords that ended a genocidal civil war in Bosnia. Most of you are too young to remember. That was in 1992. And now that we're dealing with the situation in Iraq, in Ukraine, actually this is very relevant. That there is a point that instead of airstrikes or drone strikes, the U.S. basically rolled up its sleeves and got involved, and through negotiation and diplomatic effort actually ended a very difficult conflict. I think he's probably a giant of American diplomacy. He's deserved the Nobel Peace Prize for that, ending that conflict. As they say, he's the most important diplomat not to have been Secretary of State. He came close, I think, 3 times, but it just didn't happen. But he had a career that combined private sector. For a time he worked in Wall Street. He worked in the State Department, and he also was a very avid historian. I think he had tremendous respect for academics, which was very rare. One of my first introductions to him was the actual introduction to a very important work of history on World War I by Margaret Macmillan, which is about the Peace of Versailles. And the American edition has a long introduction by Holbrook. And this is very rare, actually, to have that kind of an appreciation for what happens in universities, for intellectuals, and the like. But the lesson of it was, I would say on a personal level, what I learned from him was enormous amount of initiative and hard work matters. And then ultimately commitment matters. And I think what he stood for was the importance of diplomacy over military power. I remember when he was still alive on Afghanistan, one time General Petraeus said very affectionately to him that Holbrook is my wingman. And I remember his reaction was that I don't know since when diplomats have become the generals as wingmen. And actually in Bosnia it was the reverse. It was the military was what facilitated diplomacy. So I would say, and I try to capture in this book, aside from trying to praise a very stellar career, I think Holbrook in many ways is a foil to our foreign policy today. It's a very important counterpoint to a foreign policy that has become very focused on only use of American hard power, of military solution to problems. And he really speaks of a time that actually the world did look to the United States to solve problems. And we were very good at it. And so particularly today, I think he's a very poignant figure.
President Obama came into office and really built the foreign policy around getting out of the 2 wars that he inherited. That was going to be central to his legacy, and the United States left Iraq. The president then recently made clear that the United States would be out of Afghanistan by the time he left office, and it really looked like that was going to be the centerpiece of his foreign policy. Recent events have thrown that narrative of his foreign policy into a bit of turmoil, and we're going to get a speech tomorrow night explaining what our new strategy is in Iraq. You, in this book, are very critical of the way in which the administration and president have approached Afghanistan and Iraq, and the concerns that you raised in this book about what withdrawal would mean to those 2 places. Given how he constructed the foreign policy for most of the time in office, how does he now address the recent problems?
Well, we can always address problems, but it comes at a cost, both to us and it comes also, in this particular juncture, at a political cost to the president in particular. Because I think he made what I would call a minimalist foreign policy sort of the centerpiece of his presidency and his legacy. I think intellectually from the very beginning he articulated a view that was that, you know, less foreign policy is better for the United States. It's better that we focus at home. It was a message that resonated with the American public at a time of financial crisis. And in particular, that the best thing we can do is not to get involved in the Middle East and to withdraw from the Middle East. And in fact, if we did so, nothing really big would happen. And he basically has stuck with this idea. So I would call it, as I said, a minimalist foreign policy. It's not isolationism. It's just like, it's an idea of we should do less. Less is more here. Less is better. And I think that is right now really being seriously challenged both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So the fundamental assumption that he operated on the basis of is put to question. So the Middle East, it maybe was not a good idea for us to leave Iraq. I actually believe and it was a wrong idea, and many of the criticisms we're making of, you know, the way Iraq was managed after we left, we knew in 2010, 2011. So we draw very quickly, and I would say, you know, if you looked at our military engagements around the world, we're still in Japan, we're still in Germany, we're still in Korea, and we're still in Bosnia, or, you know, either directly or under NATO. The only major war we intervened and we're not in is actually Iraq. So those countries, you could say, have worked because we stayed, because we stayed and made sure that the political system had stability, gradually grew roots. If we'd left year one in Bosnia, probably the Serbs and the Bosnians would have been back at fighting. So the assumption that it's a good idea to go out of Iraq is now open to question. The fact that we didn't get involved in Syria opened the door for this monstrous ISIS to take root. So, you know, put these together, the argument becomes that the idea of getting out of the region quickly maybe was not a good idea. And we're finding out very quickly that we cannot say that whatever happens there stays there, and maybe we were oversensitive to the region. So when tomorrow night the president has to stand up there and basically re-engage in the country from which he withdrew, Iraq, he in a way will be conceding the fact that what happens in the Middle East does matter to us. And therefore we have vital interest there. And I think we could be at the beginning of a process of greater and greater engagement in the Middle East. It starts with airstrikes, but it may continue, it may become bigger. If there is an attack anywhere in Europe or the US traced back to Syria or Iraq, we will be back in the same place we were in 2001. So I think the fundamental foreign policy assumptions of the past 5-6 years are now seriously are put to question on, and I think that's really the challenge the president faces.
And as he thinks about trying to address the situation in Iraq, and everybody is terrified right now of ISIS and what it's doing, and of course, you know, not just the beheadings of Americans like James Foley, but you also have the moves against populations in the area, the way in which, you know, men are treated, the women and children. I mean, it's just the whole picture is the cultural heritage issues. I mean, just the full picture is quite, as you said, it's monstrous. There's a assumption behind whatever strategy we pursue that we need to have a inclusive government in Iraq that's going to be able to govern Iraq effectively and draw people to it rather than to ISIS. What are the prospects of such a government forming in Iraq?
The prospects are there, but it's not great. I mean, if Iraqis could have achieved this on their own, we would have not have had to get engaged in the first place. And I think they can do this on their own without our engagement. I mean, the whole point about American military presence in Iraq in 2006, 2007 was that you force a ceasefire between the Shias and Sunnis. That's what the surge, if you remember, you're familiar with it, when in 2006, 2007, when we put a lot of troops in Iraq, it forced a ceasefire. And that American presence then forced a political deal between the Shias and the Sunnis that neither side really wanted. But in the end, they agreed to form a government, to have a pact. So you had a bad government, corruption, mismanagement, but at least it was a government. So you come out too quickly, that comes apart. So for us to say that the Iraqis can figure this out is as much as saying that, in Ukraine, without Europe and U.S.'s help, the government in Kiev and the separatists can just, have a kumbaya moment. It's just not going to happen. It's basically, when we say these things, we're passing the buck to them. If they were perfect, we didn't need to get engaged. So yes, we need an inclusive government, but that requires outside engagement. So it requires the United States to pressure the government in Baghdad to open up to them, but we have to talk to all of our Sunni allies to force the Sunnis to come to the table as well and to accept a deal. And then we have to be prepared to provide some kind of a structure to make the deal stick. And if Republicans and Democrats can get together and fix things, the Shiites and Sunnis in Iraq surely can be excused not being able to do that. So, except there the consequences are a lot bigger. But we're familiar with these things close at home. Why people play for broke? Why people won't compromise? I mean, we see it in our own political system. Why people won't compromise? The Shiites say, they're a majority of the country. They should have absolute majority. The Sunnis said, we used to rule this place. We want a lot more power than our percentages show. You have to find a place to split the difference and make it work. But that's exactly a moment for American diplomacy. I mean, that's really when you need a Holbrooke figure or somebody like that who essentially would do the same thing that we did in the Balkans, which is to force a political deal between the Croats, the Serbs, and the Bosnians, and then to provide a structure to make the deal stick and have some longevity over time.
And do you think that, given the way things have played out in Iraq, that will lead to any reconsideration of the American approach to Afghanistan? Or, the president's, been committed to a timetable in which we would withdraw all of our combat forces. We've seen the election aftermath, has now dragged on, and it's not the situation that we might have hoped for back in the spring. Do you see any indication that there'll be a rethinking of the strategy there?
Well, there are murmurs about it, and there was a report that, in New York Times that it was discussed at a meeting at the White House, but the president was not very receptive. In reality, it should, because if you looked at Afghanistan, you would say it's not the same country as Iraq, but there's sufficient amount of parallels to make us worry. So you have an active insurgency. You have an ethnic division of the country between the Pashtuns and the non-Pashtuns, with a history of 20 years of civil war between them. You have a weak government, dysfunctional, corrupt, weak. You have no political consensus over the outcome of the election, and so you put all, and then a departing United States that has been sort of sitting in the middle of this, suffocating any kind of an uprising. So we leave without a functioning political consensus. You could very easily see that Afghanistan could go back to some form of a conflict, civil war between the Pashtuns and the Tajiks. And some of the things, when I used to work on Afghanistan, Pakistan, we used to say that the Taliban is strong because the Pashtuns are angry and not included in Kabul. So how can we get the Pashtuns better represented so they don't join the Taliban? Doesn't it sound familiar with Sunnis in Iraq? So we have ISIS because Sunnis are unhappy, angry, and disaffected. So there is a lot of parallels, and I think the administration doesn't want to admit that its rapid withdrawal from Iraq, opened the door for this thing to collapse. So we have an opportunity in Afghanistan that we either stay and give this a little bit more continuity and work on getting the political side of it standing up, or we leave quickly, and there's an, I would say, even chance that Afghanistan could also falter.
And then, if I had been asked at the beginning of the second term, where do you think the president's going to put his attention? I would have said, getting out, making sure he got out of the two wars, but also that he would hope that the big centerpiece of the second term would be the nuclear deal with Iran. Mm-hmm. And even potentially building off a nuclear deal to build a different U.S.-Iran relationship. The negotiations are ongoing. There were clearly some sticking points prior to the end of July that required that the time frame be extended. What do you see with respect to the prospects for a nuclear deal, and then even beyond a nuclear deal, a changed relationship between the United States and Iran?
Very good point. I mean, I think even now, even if you look now, you would say that still the prospect of a deal with Iran is the only positive foreign policy story that is out there. I mean, everywhere else you look at Europe, Asia, and particularly the Middle East, there's nothing to, even if it's not the administration's fault, there's nothing to show for. So the Iran deal is still, I think, a very big issue. I think the relationship has significantly shifted from where it was in November, say before June of 2014 and before November of the previous year, where there was the very first meeting in Vienna that you've had the foreign minister of Iran and the secretary of state having very open bilateral relations, a conversation between Iranian president and American president. It's rumored that Secretary Kerry routinely calls his Iranian counterpart on his cell phone when and if he's not busy with Ukraine and Iraq. So those things are actually quite significant. These are sort of small changes that have much bigger repercussions. So it's a fact now that we're trying to put together an alliance of 9 to 10 countries to fight against ISIS, most of whom really don't want to be included in that alliance. But there's actually one country that is actually really closely collaborating with the U.S. in fighting ISIS, which is not a member of that group, and that's Iran. So in the battle of this town of Amirali in northern Iraq, the Iranian forces on the ground were doing the fighting with the Shia militias, and the U.S. air power was beating ISIS positions and weakening them. There are reports out of Iran that the Supreme Leader has actually directly authorized the Revolutionary Guards to coordinate in fights against ISIS with American troops. Now, this doesn't mean that there is a red phone and a conversation. There might be more secret channels, but a lot of things happen through the Iraqi government, which obviously has very open pipeline to both sides. The Iraqi military, which has open pipelines to both sides, so they speak to Revolutionary Guards, they speak to the American military, and basically provide that. But so I mean that is quite important. You could say the nuclear deal has already facilitated this major foreign policy issue in Iraq, and if there is movement on ISIS, it may translate to greater trust at the nuclear negotiation table. But a deal between them is not out of question. They're not as far apart as we think. The problem is politics in both countries. The problem is not technical issues. They could arrive at a formula that is fairly acceptable to both sides, that Iran can't build a bomb, but could have sufficient amount of enrichment capability to do its research and have its fuel production. The problem is that the number of centrifuges that Iran would be acceptable to Iran for its own domestic political position is unacceptable in the U.S. or in Israel. And the number that the U.S. has in mind is unacceptable to Iran. And this is largely a function of the domestic political scene. So what would be considered as surrender in each country not by nuclear experts, but by the average person on the street or by the critiques of the government. So the Iranian president, being the moderate faction, cannot go home and say, I negotiated out of our 19,000 existing centrifuges, I negotiated us down to 3,000. And the American president cannot, go to Iowa and say, I allowed Iran to only give up 3,000 centrifuges. They're at 16,000 or 15,000. It's just not doable. And then you could also look and say the deadline for the negotiations is now November 24th. That's after the congressional elections in the U.S. So you could see what kind of an outcome we may have. How strong would the Obama administration be to actually be able to take a deal to Congress and say, this is a great deal. This will protect us. So I think the politics is not aligned for this. And I think what might more likely happen is that both sides decide that the best strategy is to be continuing to negotiate for the next 2 years. So you're going to continue to come up against the deadline and say, we made really great progress, but we need another 6 months. And Iran gets another $1 billion, and we get 6 more months of them not producing and opening up a few more facilities. And then that takes you to March, and then March you might say the same thing, and basically keep the process moving, or to agree potentially to a limited deal, which means you make a deal for 4 or 5 years. And already they're talking along these lines. Said again, they don't even agree on that date. So the U.S. has in mind a 20-year deal, and Iran really has in mind a 5-year deal. In the Iranian conception, within a 5-year time frame, it gets a lot of sanctions relief. The U.S. basically says in a 20-year deal, you get most of the sanctions beginning to be relieved after year 15 or year 10. So, but that might be more of a scenario going forward.
And one more question before I open up to you guys, which is I think there's some expectation that if Secretary Clinton were to in fact run for and win the presidency, that she would pursue a more activist, interventionist foreign policy than President Obama has. Do you, since you worked in her State Department for a couple of years, do you agree with that assessment, that she would pursue a more activist foreign policy?
Well, I would put it differently. The terminology I would put differently. I think the way she looks at it, that she believes that American global leadership is imperative for American security and for American prosperity. That this is not a zero-sum choice, that we either intervene in the world or we do nation building at home. That it's in reality it's not that way. So I do think that she probably would be more assertive in establishing America's global position. There are two other factors. One is that I think her experience as a Secretary of State are extremely important. She has traveled a lot around the world, and this is not just a statistic that people can dismiss. It does matter, because it does matter that she's been to everywhere and actually has heard issues from people's mouths and understands the issues. I remember, a long time before this topic was, prevalent in discussion, she was raising the issue that everywhere in Africa you go, you're dealing with Chinese investments, and we're behind the curve, and we need to do something here. Now, you're not going to get this perspective sitting in Washington and going to think tank events. You have to be there and actually arrive at at an airport built by the Chinese, drive on a road built by the Chinese, go to palaces built by the Chinese to really understand what issues are. So, whether it was leaders in ASEAN or in Africa or Latin America, have raised the issues of what is the problem when America basically factors itself out of the conversation. So I think he has a very keen understanding, she has a very keen understanding of what the issues are, where does American policy matter, why does it matter, and I think that experience is really germane. The other big issue is, I think by the end of the administration, there's going to be a big debate about the issues that President Obama raised. Do we need a foreign policy? Do we need an activist foreign policy? Do we need a minimalist foreign policy? A lot of the issues that we talk about but we really don't seriously debate, because it's right now partisan. So the Republicans criticize, the Democrats in a knee-jerk fashion defend. But in reality, I think there's going to be a debate back about this issue. And any politician who becomes president is not going to be separate from the outcome of that debate, and he's going to be part of that debate. But I think that debate is coming. And then the third is, we cannot ignore what's happened in these past 6 years, which is American reputation and American credibility has got a massive hit. I say this from experience, talking to people in the Middle East, in Asia. People don't believe what we say. We make little of the red line in Syria, remember? But that to most of the world was extremely important. There's a time that people were afraid of the U.S. doing too much, or may have thought we may not do certain things, but they actually believed in the policies that we put forward. So, whatever the president says tomorrow night, the American people will interpret it one way, but everybody else around the world is going to be, they hear what they hear, but the question becomes, will it actually be put in practice? Will you actually see to your policy? And I think a challenge for the next president is how to restore the trust in American policy, that confidence factor, which is very important. And I think that will impose its own rules on anybody who's president. So it's not like, it's a parenthesis around the Obama administration and you say, let's forget these 8 years have happened and we go back. So that's going to be, I think one wants to see what is anybody who becomes president, what is their plan for restoring trust in American leadership, credibility in American policy. And it really matters because, there is a point at which you decide you need the world and you want them to do things. The question of whether they actually will follow you or listen to you has a lot to do with whether they have any confidence in you.
All right, well, let's open it up. And so what I would ask is, we have a couple mics here, and if you can introduce yourself when you ask a question, and try to make it a question and try to make it a brief question so we have time. I see you over there. Betsy, I was going to ask, do we have any students who would like to ask a question first?
Yes, if students don't ask questions, we can always call on them. So.
Here, there's the mic.
Good afternoon, Dean Golgar, Dean Nasr. Kind of to your last point.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name's Chris Evanson, senior undergraduate here at SIS. Kind of to your last point, there seems to be a growing conversation that President Obama is a weak president on the international scale. And I was just wondering if you kind of put into practice what a strong president would look like and kind of restoring that credibility you were just talking about.
Well, I wouldn't put it as weak or strong. I think that's a sort of a domestic political use of term. I would put it in that he has a theory of the case from the day he became president, which was that there was too much focus on foreign policy, and within that foreign policy focus, there was too much focus on the Middle East, and that his contribution to the United States would be to right-size this commitment much less on the Middle East, and much less on foreign policy, right? So I think I think to this day he sees this as his intellectual contribution to the United States, to its interests, to its future, to its foreign policy. So I think within that framework, I think that's what he has to sort of defend and be tested. Is this a correct assumption? So I would say that when he decided not to bomb Syria over the red line, it's not a matter that he was afraid or he was weak. Is that he contemplated that that would go against that fundamental assumption that he put on the table. That A, this is really a big deal, merits us going in, and secondly, if we start bombing Syria, it's tantamount to going back to the Middle East and a slippery slope to war. So it was always a debate with that fundamental assumption that he put on the table. Now, a different president may come with a very different set of assumptions about whether foreign policy matters, whether Asia matters, Middle East matters, Europe matters. So I think that's the way to think about it. I don't think he's weak. I mean, when it came to cases like bin Laden, etc., he was fairly decisive. Actually, if you take drone strategy and use of drones, I think he's been very aggressive on that, or on NSA listening on a lot of these issues. So he's not squeamish, I think, about use of tools of foreign policy. I think the real question is his fundamental assumptions correct, as opposed to whether he's strong or not.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When the administration, when officials in the first term really talked about this issue of balancing, they would focus on this. The way they would describe it was, we've been overbalanced in our foreign policy in Europe and the Middle East. We need to rebalance and devote more attention to Asia, and that we will be able to draw resources as we draw down in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's going to free up all sorts of resources, and not just money, but time and attention. If you're spending all your time thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan, you don't have that time to think about China or Southeast Asia. And so this, I agree. This was the intellectual underpinnings of the foreign policy, and I think that the pushback now. We had Aaron Miller here last night on campus, and Vali in this book basically arguing, we're in the Middle East. We're not leaving the Middle East. Certainly, if we were to leave the Middle East, you see the kinds of things that emerge in the Middle East. We do have strong interests across the region. I think that's part of the other piece of this was there was some sense that, well, especially now with our own energy resources, and we're going to be this large exporter, and we're fracking everywhere, and we don't have to worry about our dependence on oil from the region, that we just don't have to worry about being as engaged. And we've found that that's not the case.
That's not the case, exactly.
Yes, Professor Cohn, we can now, that we've had a student. It doesn't have to be quick.
Very quick.
It doesn't have to be quick. I just wanted to get a student first.
I just wanted to round
Now we
up-
can have a professor.
I just wanted to round out the conversation, which has been wonderful so far on addressing ISIS, and you talk about the multiple aspects of addressing in Iraq. What about in Syria?
Mm-hmm.
How can the United States respond in a way that doesn't make it look like that we are assisting Assad, or in other ways dragging us into some sort of longer-term commitment that the American public and American Congress wouldn't tolerate?
Well, that's actually a very good point. I mean, Syria is the much bigger problem because in Iraq, there's even politically speaking, as Jim mentioned, there is a path. There is a government. If you get it to be inclusive, there is an Iraqi military that you could beef up, and you could say a way into getting Iraq stabilized. Syria is a full-bore civil war in which the government no longer controls large parts of the country. We don't have a relationship with the government. And neither side is likely to win, at least in the near future. So but in the end, you could say at the same time you can't leave it alone anymore for varieties of reasons. Syria has already produced close to 8 million refugees. It's about a quarter of Jordan's population, maybe about 1/6 of Lebanon's population are now Syrian refugees, unlikely to now, under the circumstances, ever to go back. So it's going to change, not only it's going to change the demography of the region, it's going to cause political trouble in other parts. And then, Syria is producing the worst horrors of the region in terms of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the like. So, there's one or two ways of thinking about it. One is, this is the Russian argument, that it's all about fighting terrorism and jihadists, and, you're not going to do it, we're not going to do it, you let Assad do it. Which, ironically, is actually our old Middle East strategy of supporting dictators to suppress, undesirable elements, fundamentalists and the like. So that's one strategy. That's the one that the Russians are pursuing. I think there is some inclination in the West increasingly that maybe this is inevitable, because we never invested in moderates. There are no moderates right now to actually say, even if Assad fell, who's going to take over? And we really don't have any other game plan here. So this is one option. It doesn't mean that we actually formally send weapons to Assad, but the Western governments may basically just look the other way, as Assad will gain strength through Russia and Iran and basically plow through the country. The second is that you actually try to provide an answer, not to Assad, but at least to ISIS. And that's at least a 2-3 year process of trying to arm and build a new Syrian militia, military, whatever you want to call it, that actually is capable of gradually taking over parts of Syria that are not under Assad's control. So the argument is that we're not going to end the civil war, but we might decide which is the Sunni side of the civil war. And then let's duke them out. They can duke it out after that and see who wins, which is a much larger commitment. It's not a few airstrikes. This actually requires trainers on the ground. It requires a lot of money. It requires standing up an army. And the third option is basically that we do an equivalent of the Dayton Peace Agreement, which is back to Holbrooke in that way, which is try to stop the civil war. And come up with some kind of a political settlement. That's going to include Assad for now. Just like the Dayton Peace Agreement included Milosevic in Serbia. So basically you have to have another side in order to get a deal. So you try to get some kind of a structure that would provide for a ceasefire and then for some kind of a political settlement. So you hope then that the majority Sunni population will agree to this. The Alawites, the Christians, those who are in Assad's camp would agree to this. And this actually basically will finish the civil war. This is kind of like a fast-track Lebanon scenario. Lebanon had a civil war for 15 years. It ended up with some kind of a political settlement. It's very fragile, but it has held. And you could envision that. Or a variation of this is that you expedite some kind of this basically breakup of Syria. So you would say that, okay, there's going to be an Alawite territory and then there's going to be a Sunni territory. Now this one's not as desirable because you still have to figure out who's going to be ruling over the Sunni territory. But we're not even having any of these conversations. I'm sure people in closed rooms, etc., are having it, but there's no attempt to sort of have this kind of a discussion publicly or prepare the American public for the fact that Syria we have to do something about Syria. Again, back to those assumptions. The assumption that Syria doesn't matter, we don't need to get involved in it. It's not really a vital interest to the United States. That's actually no longer easily defensible. So we'd have to do something.
We'll go back there and then we'll come over to you guys.
Good afternoon. My name is Ken Mann. I'm a freshman here at SIS. I was curious as to whether or not you thought that there's going to be an independent Kurdistan at the end of all of this going on in Iraq, and also whether or not you think the Kurdish government and the Peshmerga would be able to sustain an independent Kurdistan once it got that.
I don't think there will be an independent Kurdistan because its two biggest neighbors, and particularly Iran, have very clearly drawn a red line that they will not tolerate that. Before ISIS appeared, the Kurds already had a plan for coming out and then going back in, which is declare independence and then rejoin Iraq as a confederation, because that would allow them to go around the oil law. Currently, as a part of Iraq, they're not really allowed to negotiate their own oil deals with foreign countries. So any country that's doing business with northern Iraq is in violation of Iraqi constitution. And actually, Kurdish oil has been confiscated on high seas for that purpose, for that reason. But then ISIS happened, and this talk of separation came up. But even then, the Iranian supreme leader in Tehran had told very clearly to the Kurdish president Masoud Barzani that independence is a red line. That we won't accept the dismemberment of Iraq. And I think the Turks also would be very nervous about a fully independent Kurdish region. So I think the Kurdish region is going to continue to sort of hover in this quasi-independent relationship with Iraq. It's landlocked. Unless the United States, really signs up to protecting its independence, it could be very easily overrun or undermined by its neighbors. And so I think particularly as ISIS may recede a bit in Iraq, the argument is going to become weaker. But what's already happened is that the Kurds have used ISIS very cleverly to gain more territory. So they took over Kirkuk, the city of Kirkuk, which was disputed. They've expanded their zone of control, and also they've basically moved the independence conversation much further. And then they've got the United States to make a massive investment in the Peshmerga. So that obviously is now a much more bigger military, which is now in formal alliance with the United States. And we have approached this very clearly as a way of dividing Iraq. So we say we're working with the Iraqi government and the Peshmerga. So they've gained a great deal, but I think they may not necessarily actually need a formal independence anymore. That's just a piece of paper. They have everything they want. The only thing is maybe get a status like Scotland, so they can have their own soccer team or something in the World Cup. But other than that, they basically have virtually everything that goes with independence.
There was a woman here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Erica Parges. I'm a freshman here at SIS. So my main question would be in regards to the ISIS and Iran and the U.S. being together. Do you think this is now a formal step in future Iran and U.S. diplomatic relations?
Well, I would say it is a very helpful step because it does a couple of things. One is that it is underscoring the fact that they do share some vital interests. So it's not true that we never see eye to eye, we have nothing to work together on something that really matters to the United States. They are actually a big part of the solution. So that is important in diplomacy because whenever you want to engage somebody, you have to have some common ground to build on. And this is a very good common ground. Secondly, I think it will provide a very useful public opinion tool on both sides. Because ultimately, if the Iranians are fighting ISIS, which the president is going to make clear tomorrow night is our number one priority right now, then you can't just put them in a bad column all the time. So they're not the existential threat that people made them. Existential threat of the week is ISIS. And Iran happens to be on the right side of the ledger on that issue. So that's useful. The question is, what would the two sides do with this public relations advantage that they have gained? And then, there is also a trust factor between the two countries. The U.S. as a whole does not trust Iran at all. And the Iranian president only, a week ago said in a public speech that Iranians and him also personally don't trust the United States. So the more they can do together and see that, the sky didn't fall apart, nobody cheated anybody else, it actually is good. It's a trust-building exercise for them going forward.
This gentleman here, yeah. And then I'll come over to you.
Thank you. John Stowell, grad student, U.S. Foreign Policy. Could you articulate your position on U.S. military bases in the Middle East? You said that we should maybe stay a little bit longer in Afghanistan, but you were also saying that the Balkans are at peace because we still have a military presence there. So are you suggesting that we should have a military presence in Iraq and Afghanistan indefinitely? And I'd also say that Al-Qaeda used American presence in Saudi Arabia as a recruiting tool, and it looks like ISIS is kind of using that same tool to goad Americans in and to recruit more. And then finally, I would ask what that would mean for Iran nuclear negotiations if Iran thought that the U.S. was going to have a military presence on both sides of its borders.
Well, all of the issues you raise are true, and actually a number of our military presences in the region have been growing, just not in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we now have a very big base in Qatar, which is the headquarters of CENTCOM, our Central Command. We have the headquarters of the Navy's Fifth Fleet is in Bahrain. We have large bases in the region. But so we have to say, what are the order of priorities? If we want to stabilize Iraq and Afghanistan, so we invested $1 trillion in Iraq, and then if you add Afghanistan, $1.5 to $2 trillion in these two wars. So you would say the purpose was to create a sufficiently stable political system that doesn't provide a no man's land in which either Al-Qaeda or ISIS could grow. So the function of the U.S. military here is largely to continue to provide that ceasefire and peace and provide the stability for the political process to work and grow. So if you looked at the Balkans, we didn't invade, we weren't in there. We forced the two sides to come, all the three sides to come to Dayton to sign a peace agreement. And then NATO and mostly initially US forces, now European forces, basically deployed in the Balkans to prevent fighting and also to enforce the peace deal, right? So every year that they stayed there, every year that you had peace, meant that there was the wound began to heal further. So now you have a generation in Bosnia that has been born after the Dayton Peace Agreement. Okay, there's another generation, the likelihood that they won't go to war becomes further. So the first and foremost function of the keeping the militaries there is that it actually, what we've achieved even thus far, doesn't actually fall apart completely, as it did in Iraq. Then you would basically go further and say, well, why would we keep them? And these conversations we've had with NATO or in Asia. So, the reason why U.S. military stayed in Germany was to make sure fascists don't come back, communists don't take over, and German democracy takes hold. At some point, it became about the Soviet Union and invasion of the West, and now there's really open question about whether we need bases here or there. So ultimately, I think that's the way we ought to think about Afghanistan and Iraq. How long do we need to keep what number of troops to ensure that stability continues? And then if there is secondary reasons for that, it'd be different. Iran clearly doesn't want U.S. troops on any of its borders. But they have a very different theory of the case. The Iranians may think that United States is a bigger threat than the Taliban or ISIS, for instance. So that doesn't mean that we necessarily share the same strategic vision. The small countries in the Middle East want U.S. bases because when you have a base in a country, and this was always Singapore's model, when you build a base on a small country, the United States becomes your military. So the government of Qatar very willingly gave the United States over 100 square miles of base to build. Every time you ask them for more land for the base, they will give it to you willingly. Because then, the U.S., they don't have to invest in the military. The U.S. is their military. The same in Bahrain, the same in Singapore. So they have a very different strategic vision. And in those countries, you don't see any opposition in the Arab world to the Qatari regime for inviting the United States in. Or you don't see any opposition among the Sunnis to Bahrain giving land and bases to the U.S. And yes, Al-Qaeda does try to use this as a recruitment tool, as a way of arguing that we're invading the region, occupying the region. But I think they would anyways. If we were to backtrack to before invasion of Iraq, the many other options would have been on the table. And I would say that invasion was a mistake. But once you did it, you can't ignore that it's happened. That, okay, we shattered this country, and it's not Iraq. It's not a moral duty necessarily to put it back together. It's actually in our own self-interest to put it back together. And Iraq's not going to go back to where it was in 2002. It's just not going to happen. So our presence there should be really driven at ultimately freeing ourselves of having to be thinking about Iraq. I mean, think about it. If you went back to 2011, everybody in this city said, we're done with Iraq. Great, good riddance. From front page of the newspaper to the back page, if that. We don't want to have anything to do with it. Our great achievement is to withdraw. 0 troops. In fact, there is a word in Washington, it's called the zero option for both Afghanistan and Iraq. And look, it's back to the front page and we're back in. So that's what we really ought to avoid. You want a final solution to things that then you really can take your hands off of it.
There was yes. Right back there.
Hi, my name is Nathan Shirk. I'm a graduate student here at American University, studying international politics. I'm also an intern at the Sindhi American Political Action Committee. And my question is in regards to Islamic extremism. We spoke about ISIS and what to do about them in Syria. But what we see is a lot of the ideology, a lot of the fighters, and a lot of the money comes from countries with which we are allied, such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Pakistan for Afghanistan. The ISIS has been accused of supporting a lot of the forces we fight inside of Afghanistan. So my question to you is, how does the United States address these issues with countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Qatar for them to reform and maybe change their educational system or their whatever else it is they're doing to minimize the presence and the influence of extremism inside of their own country?
Well, very good question. And it's a big problem for U.S. foreign policy. In other words, we look for problems. It's like the story of the drunk looking for his keys where the light is rather than where he lost it. So that element is very much there. This is a problem. We have a very intricate, intertwined relationship with the Persian Gulf countries. And this is not only about energy, it's also about their investments. It's about purchase of military hardware. Some of the biggest backers of a very strong relationship are actually arms sales, arms manufacturers, not oil companies and the like. And the way American politics, Washington works, policy is not formulated in the abstract and then implemented in the abstract. There's a lot of different pressure that comes to bear on it. But I would say fundamentally it's not an ideological issue. It is an ideology, but it doesn't really have to do with educational system and the like. that explains why, in a particular country you might have a particular group of people who have a certain understanding of Islam and the like. Fundamentally, it's about realpolitik and power. So even people who go join ISIS, the attraction for some at some level might be religious, but for a lot of people, it's about the exercise of power that ISIS shows. So why is it so attractive to European Muslims? It's the show of power that ISIS shows. It's not the ideology. Even the ideology is about power. This is not about an Islam that opts out of the world, and it's only about a life of piety and pure existence. This is about saying that the best way in which to gain worldly power is by using this particular ideology. That's where the attraction of ISIS comes. And again, you would say, well, why do these governments support these groups? So in Syria, why did the Persian Gulf countries support the most radical groups? Because they're the most effective. I mean, if you're trying to defeat Iran and Hezbollah and the so-called moderates can't shoot straight and are ran over, and these people are really putting up a stiff fight, then money gravitates towards them. It's not just the Gulf. Even the Turkish government was accused of supporting the Victory Front, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate. Why would, although they deny it, but the point was that why would they do it? Because they made a commitment, rightly or wrongly, to bring Assad down, and then they found out there's nobody really putting even a moderate fight against Assad other than these radical groups, and so money and support began to flow to them. So, to really dissuade them, yes, you can pressure them. You can actually really get serious with them. You could, focus on that, as we did with Pakistan on occasion, with the Taliban. Or you have to see why is it that they're doing this. So I would say part of the problem of why everybody has been funding ISIS or Victory Front is because when the United States factored itself out of Syria and said, you know what, we're just not interested, everybody in the region basically began to look after their own interests, and they became, so some of them gravitated to very radical groups, and that became their instrument, if you would. Now, if you do show a solution to these problems, it's a very important way of dissuading some of these countries to invest in these kinds of forces.
I think there was, yeah, we have. I think what we'll do, we have you. Okay, we'll take these. We'll just group these three questions together, and then we'll let people go and get refreshments. So go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Nasr, for joining us. My name is Robert Weinstein. I'm a first-year U.S. Foreign Policy graduate student here at SAS. One thing you had mentioned a bit earlier in the talk was the the current vacuum that you see for an Ambassador Holbrooke-like figure in brokering a Shia-Sunni deal in Iraq right now. And one question I had is, number one, is there really a figure that is comparable to him that exists in U.S. diplomacy right now, who can sort of bring the same negotiating prowess, the same energy to a brokering a deal that Ambassador Holbrooke did back in in Bosnia. And secondly, if there really isn't someone on the horizon like that, then are there other kind of mechanisms to drive that same type of power into a negotiation absent someone like Ambassador Holbrooke?
Great, and then we'll take this one here, and I'm going to add a question to his on Holbrooke. Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm John Ambrose. I'm an alumni from SIS. It still feels weird to say that.
Good. Welcome back.
Welcome back.
So building off the questions about kind of addressing the U.S. role in the region going forward, but more from a political aspect, with the paradigm shift that's occurred in the wake of the Arab awakenings, how would you see kind of implementing U.S. policy in the region in the wake of this paradigm shift in terms of dealing with Arab publics which have a much larger voice and tend to regard U.S. action in the region with more skepticism? How do we address our role moving forward in light of these new developments and in light of this kind of new reality that is going to grow in the Middle East?
Hello, my name is Luke Toma. I'm a undergraduate freshman here at SIS. And my question for you is, there's a lot of fundamental assumptions a lot of world leaders make about foreign policy. You can see that with Putin's fundamental assumption about how the West reacts towards Russia. And you mentioned Obama's assumptions about how the United States should act. But as people who want to go into these fields, do you have any recommendations for which assumptions we should lay aside in the future in terms of how best the United States can move forward, rather than using assumptions like Obama's doing? He's using Bush's assumptions about drones to impact our policy in the Middle East. What do you think are assumptions that are becoming outdated or rather dangerous in the world today?
Wow, what a great set of questions. That's a good way to end. All right, go ahead, and then I'm going to add this one.
I'll go that way
this
so you
person.
can do that.
All right, okay.
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, largely, you have rhetoric, you have assumption, and you have interests. And I think you have to understand all of these. So what is public rhetoric? What is rhetoric for international consumption for your own public? And what is real? Secondly is essentially what are the people's assumptions? I mean, you have to start by taking those very seriously. So is Putin truly worried about eastward expansion of NATO, Ukraine joining Europe, or is he seriously worried about the United States, or conversely, that he thinks his assumption is that this is a perfect opportunity, we're busy, this is the right time to do it. He may have assumptions about Ukraine itself, that he will fracture, that it will not be able to get its act together to respond. So all of these assumptions are important. I mean, it's like playing chess with somebody. But you also have to take people's interests or countries' interests seriously. So why is Russia interested as a country in Ukraine, not Putin? What is Russia's overall interest? And we often sometimes make assumptions as well. Like we say, well, it's better for Russia to focus on its economy, right? It's better for Iraqis to get along. Who says? Maybe they don't see it that way. I mean, if you thought about it, everybody says it's better for Republicans and Democrats to cooperate. It clearly is evident that the Republican Party doesn't share that view. It's not in its interest right now to cooperate. And you have to take that assumption seriously. So the Republican Party is making a set of assumptions about the next elections, about the public mood, and you have to take those seriously. So that's what makes the game of diplomacy and international affairs an art in some ways, and it's sophisticated. It requires understanding part psychology, part history, strategy, and ultimately you have to have that sort of a broad view, and that's really what your education should give you, not just the substance, but those kinds of analytical tools and that kind of understanding. The paradigm in the Middle East is continuing to shift. That's part of the challenge. The idea that we had immediately after the Arab Spring, that you have sort of people's power, has actually imploded in many places. So at least maybe in the larger places that really matter. So in Egypt, it has collapsed out of the crucible of uprising and coup and suppression. Iraq and Syria are basically in a virtual civil war in which people's power doesn't matter. And even in the Palestinian territories, you had a really brutal war that has changed this idea that there's going to be some kind of a public statement about the direction that things go. So there is worry in the region over ISIS. There is unhappiness over the direction of things. I would say the Middle East is both angry at what the U.S. did in the past, and is also very angry at the way in which the U.S. abandoned the region. And I think there are times when what people really dislike about intensive U.S. meddling is no meddling at all. And so we have to sort of get a gauge of how this moves forward. So I mean, if you right now said, okay, what is the Iraqi public opinion? or what is the Syrian public opinion. One, in that sense, doesn't exist. These are sort of very fractured countries. I think what's important is that the U.S. has to articulate what is its interest in this region, and why does it want a certain outcome, and then how is it going to get that outcome. So, when people in the region are going to listen to the president tomorrow night, that's what they're going to be listening for. So when you look at ISIS, when you look at Iraq, what do you see? Is this a humanitarian endeavor you're doing out of some sense of moral duty, or do you have a vital interest here? If it is, what is it? And then how are you going to go about addressing it? Our allies want to hear that before they sign up to anything. And that's a much better guide. I don't think you can build foreign policy in a region of the world based on public opinion there. It's in public opinion is important, but we're not doing foreign policy out of a popularity contest. We're doing foreign policy to protect and further American interests, and that has to be the fundamental guide. If we don't have an interest somewhere, we shouldn't be there. If we have an interest there, we have to be very clear what it is and how we're going to serve it. So the biggest criticism of the Bush administration invasion of Iraq is not, I would say, is not that he invaded Iraq and wrecked the country. That is at one level. The point is that it overreached in terms of what is American interest in the region. So he said American interest is that there should be no terrorism in the Middle East. And how we're going to make sure there's no terrorism in the Middle East, we're going to do radical surgery and raise a perfect democracy in Iraq. That's what, so the statement about our interest was overstated. The solution was over the top, and therefore it failed as a result. You could say the Obama administration has gone to the extreme other side, that it didn't see any interest, and it's not very clear about how it's going to address the interests that it actually identifies. So you have to have a balance. I think both are correct at some level, but not in their sort of pure form. We do have an interest that there be no terrorism in the Middle East. That's true, but a full-scale invasion of a large country to build a democracy is not the best way of answering that interest. Now, there always is a person like that who would arise. I think when they emerge, a Holbrooke emerges or a Henry Kissinger, at that point in time you don't know it. It's really just like wars produce big generals. I think big diplomatic occasions produce big diplomats. But my experience with Holbrooke, and when you look at a lot of successful diplomats, the characteristics are interesting. They're part salesmen. They're more like people who close mergers and acquisition deals in Wall Street than sort of very placid contractual agreements. I mean, when I watch Holbrooke in practice, his point was just to find a little thing he could pull each side further. And neither side wants to talk to one another. It's kind of like two companies that have nothing to do with each other. The question is, how do you pull a rabbit out of the hat and get people to actually talk and then arrive at a deal? So it does require particular qualities. It's not always something that you learn in a textbook. There's two things in the job of foreign service. Many of you are going to join it. You'll know some of it is basically very straightforward, is by the book. These are the things that have to happen. If you're sitting in Cairo, you're composing a cable, you're sending it to Washington. If you're receiving a cable in Washington, this is what you do with it. There's a lot of process, right? But cutting a deal making is exactly that. It's deal making. And that requires somebody who can operate above and beyond the boundaries of what they do. But you have to give them that opportunity. I mean, the president has to tell somebody, you're my envoy, you go to Iraq or you go to Ukraine, you have full support, and your job is to find a way to stop this thing. Now, they may fail at it, but unless you send somebody there, you don't get to see whether somebody can actually rise to that challenge. So we won't know if there is a Holbrook because we're not approaching these conflicts with that kind of an ambition. And
You've answered my question as well. That I was going to get to that because you have to be able to empower somebody to be able to do that. And this administration really has not taken that type of approach. It's great. I'm so thrilled so many of you came out today, and especially our first-year students. It's great for you guys to be so engaged right away. I love bringing high-level guests here to have the opportunity to interact with you, but one of the main reasons I do like to bring them is because I like to show off our students. So good job with the questions.
You did a very good job of that today.
I would encourage you, we have same time, same place next week. We have an event here on the UN and global governance, so I hope to see many of you at that. And we do have refreshments outside, and especially for the undergraduates, it's a chance to let the dean try to recruit you for his graduate program. So we've got to give him that opportunity since we brought him over. But it's just great to have Vali here. It's just, he's done, as I said, he's done such a great job in a very short period of time at Johns Hopkins SAIS with a lot of new initiatives. And it's nice to watch from across town, see what he's up to. But congratulate him again on this book, The Dispensable Nation. And I assume, unless his job's very different from mine, that he doesn't have a new one coming out anytime soon. But we hope that at some point you get a chance to write another book. But it's great having you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your hospitality. Thank you.